So I want you to picture a library, like a massive, echoing, practically infinite library that has been under construction for, well, for about 3,000 years.
Oh, yeah. A really, really heavy, dense library.
Right, and the shelves are just packed, floor to ceiling, with every major philosophical work ever written. You've got, utilitarianism taking up the East Wing. Kant's categorical imperatives basically get a whole floor to themselves.
Endless debates.
Yeah.
Just agonizing over what is good or, what is just.
Exactly. And of course, there's an entirely separate annex just for those thought experiments where you have to decide who gets run over by a runaway trolley.
The trolley problems, yeah. Every book in that library is essentially built on the same premise, right? Figuring out human values by just arguing about them.
But what if we've been looking in the wrong building entirely? Like, what if all those brilliant minds for 3 millennia have just been ignoring a much simpler, entirely measurable question?
It's a huge thought.
It is. And today we're digging into a really fascinating foundational essay by Elias Kunis. It's called The Question Nobody Asks. And our mission for this deep dive is, well, it's a big one.
Yeah, we're trying to see if we can bypass all of that.
Right. We want to see if we can completely bypass traditional moral philosophy and derive ethics entirely from the physics of engineering and survival. Okay, let's unpack this. Because saying we can replace Socrates with thermodynamics sounds wild. Where do we even start with a claim like that?
So to understand how Kunis pulls this off, we actually have to look at the roadblock that stopped philosophers from even trying to find an empirical, physics-based answer in the first place.
Well, why did they give up on science for this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have to rewind to 1739, to David Hume. He created what's known in philosophy as Hume's guillotine, or the is-ought gap.
The is-ought gap, okay.
Hume essentially proved, and quite brilliantly for his time, that you cannot look at a factual description of the world like it simply is, and logically derive from that what you ought to do, or what you ought to value.
Because, science is purely descriptive, right? It tells you how many rocks are in a field, what they weigh, and, their velocity if you throw them.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't tell you if you should throw those rocks at your neighbor's window.
That is the core of it. Physics, chemistry, biology,
right.
They describe the universe. They cannot prescribe human behavior. And because Hume's proof was so logically rigorous, it basically became a foundational rule.
Case closed.
Case closed. And it led directly to this modern, almost thought-terminating cliche that values are entirely subjective.
Right. The logic being that since you can't get ethics from physics, ethics must just be unmoored from the physical universe. Like they have to come from human intuition or religion or, social constructs.
Exactly.
I want to push back on this, though, using the analogy Kunis actually brings up in the essay. Think about a massive suspension bridge.
Okay, the bridge analogy. I love this one.
Yeah. When a bridge collapses into a river, we don't stand around the rubble and say, wow, those engineers had really bad subjective moral values. Their philosophy was just out of style.
No, obviously not. You'd say they violated physics.
Right. The bridge collapsed because it couldn't withstand tension and gravity. The universe doesn't care if your subjective preference is for the bridge to stay up. If you build it wrong, it falls. So why isn't survival, like the persistence of a biological system or a civilization, treated like a bridge?
And that exact question is the workaround.
Yeah.
That's the bypass Kunis identifies. Hume's guillotine chops off arguments that say, physics says you ought to value X. That's a normative statement. It's making a moral judgment.
And Kunis isn't doing that.
No, Kunis isn't making a normative statement. He's making a conditional one.
A conditional statement. So instead of moral imperative, it's more like an if-then scenario.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
If you want to persist, X must be true. That's not a value judgment.
Yeah.
That is a strict engineering constraint.
Oh.
Physics absolutely can tell you what must be true for a physical structure to avoid collapsing. Hume's guillotine was this excuse to stop looking for an empirical foundation for behavior. But the bypass was sitting there the whole time.
So if you want any future to exist, certain configurations of matter are just required, and others are strictly forbidden by the laws of thermodynamics.
Precisely.
Okay, I'm with you on the bridge. But a bridge is a static object, right? If we're talking about survival and ethics, we're talking about active things. Animals, humans, maybe whole societies. How does this physics framework differentiate between, say, a boulder rolling down a hill and a living thing trying to survive? A rock persists, but it doesn't have ethics.
Right. Well, a rock is passive. It just lets the universe happen to it. To make this framework function, Kunis defines a very specific type of machine called a telic system.
A telic system.
Yeah, a telic system is anything that maintains local order against entropy by processing information.
Let's bring the listener in on this real quick. Entropy is just the universe's baseline tendency to move toward disorder and chaos, right? Heat dissipates, iron rusts, things just fall apart over time.
Exactly. So a telic system is actively fighting that universal decay.
Yeah.
It uses information to pursue a goal, even if that baseline goal is just, keep existing.
Got it.
A single bacterium is a telic system. A massive multinational corporation is a telic system. A human mind, a whole civilization, or even a future AI. They all subordinate thermodynamics to computation. They gather information to build order and survive.
The essay uses this incredible contrast to make this mechanical difference real. Think about a hurricane versus a virus.
Oh, it's such a good example.
Right. A hurricane is immensely powerful. It has a structure, but it has no goal. It's just passively following energy gradients to maximize entropy. It's essentially the universe's way of dissipating heat over the ocean as fast as possible.
Right. The hurricane burns itself out by design. It blindly obeys physics to create disorder.
But a virus is completely different. A virus carries a tiny specification sheet like its RNA or DNA. It actively hijacks its environment to execute that spec sheet and replicate.
Yes.
It doesn't just blindly follow physics. It uses physics to maintain its own internal order against the chaos of the outside world.
What's fascinating here is that the universe contains both of these things, right? The passive systems like the hurricane and the goal-directed telic systems like the virus, or you, the listener. And the absolute second a goal-directed system pops into existence, it immediately slams into a wall of non-negotiable physical constraints.
You can't philosophize your way out of these roadblocks.
No, you have to engineer a solution.
And this is where we hit the core of Kunis's essay. The 4 axiomatic dilemmas of physics. Every single telic machine, from a microbe to a galactic empire, faces all 4. Let's start with the most fundamental one, the thermodynamic dilemma. This is basically the reality of finite energy.
It is the ultimate zero-sum game of the universe. Every single joule of energy a system spends on maintaining its current structure is a joule it cannot spend on growth or adaptation.
Think of it like a strict budget. If you own a factory and you spend all your money fixing the leaky roof and repairing old machines, you have nothing left to invest in new technology.
Right, and eventually a competitor outpaces you and you die.
Exactly. But on the flip side, if you spend all your money expanding and building new factories and you just ignore the maintenance of the ones you have the roof caves in and you die, you have to constantly balance the preservation of what you already are against the transformation into what you need to become.
But surviving isn't just about managing your energy battery. If you're a system gathering energy, you have to know what you actually are. Right? Where does the machine end and the environment begin? This creates the boundary dilemma.
Right, because any complex system is made of smaller parts, and it has to figure out how to optimize those individual parts versus the whole collective.
And the medical analogy Kunis uses here makes this chillingly clear. If a biological system optimizes entirely for the individual part at the expense of the whole, what does that look like mechanically?
It's cancer.
Yes, it's cancer. A rogue cell hoards resources, replicates endlessly, and ignores the collective until the host body dies, and then the cancer dies with it.
But the inverse is just as fatal, right? If you optimize purely for the collective and suppress the needs of the individual parts entirely, you get exploitation.
Exactly.
The overarching system just burns through and consumes its own parts until there's nothing left to sustain the whole, and it starves. Finding that exact boundary where both the part and the whole thrive is a physics problem, not a political one.
And once you establish that boundary, you have an inside and an outside, which immediately creates a totally new problem.
Yeah.
How does the inside know what the outside is doing?
The information dilemma.
Yes. To act effectively, a system has to model reality. And models come with severe physical trade-offs. You basically have 2 options for gathering data. You can rely on cheap, cached historical data. For an animal, this is instinct. For a human society, it's tradition.
It costs very little energy to just do what you've always done because, well, the computation was already paid for in the past.
Right.
Let's ground this for the listener real quick. Think about your daily commute to work. You probably drive the same route every single day. That is cheap, cached historical data. You can do it on autopilot, sipping your coffee, listening to us, expending almost zero mental energy.
But the danger of that cheap data is that the environment might have changed.
Exactly. What if a bridge washed out overnight? Your cheap, cached instinct tells you to keep driving, and boom, you go right off a cliff.
Right, so the alternative to that autopilot is expensive, real-time sensing, constantly scanning, observing, running experiments, updating your model of reality.
Which keeps you alive.
It does. It's highly accurate and prevents you from driving off the cliff, but it carries a massive metabolic cost. If you analyze every single inch of the road, every single day, you'll be exhausted before you even get to work.
So, a system must balance the energy efficiency of cheap historical data against the vital accuracy of expensive real-time data.
Wow. Okay, so you have your energy budget, your boundaries, and your data. How do you act on it?
That brings us to the final constraint, the control dilemma. This is about coordination. If a system spots a threat, how does it make a decision?
Right.
You can structure your control to be centralized. Think a single brain or a single CEO. This is incredibly fast and decisive,
Yeah.
but it is horribly brittle. If the central node gets confused or goes down, the entire system is paralyzed and dies.
And the alternative is distributed control, like bottom-up coordination. Think of a flock of birds or, decentralized network.
That is highly resilient. You can take out pieces of it and the system just keeps going. But it's painfully slow to organize. You have to balance the precision and speed of centralization against the resilience of decentralization.
These four dilemmas, thermodynamics, boundaries, information, and control, they create what Kunis calls the world, time, and self problems.
Which are?
How do you model the world? How do you allocate resources over time? Where do you draw the boundaries of self? You, listening right now, face these whether you're managing a family, running a startup, or just deciding how to spend your weekend.
This is the ultimate survival test imposed by the universe. So what does a passing grade look like? Because this is the exact moment where Kunis argues physics creates what we have mistakenly been calling ethics for 3,000 years. If a telic system survives these dilemmas over deep time, how does it behave?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a system that successfully solves these four dilemmas naturally exhibits four optimal observable strategies. Kunis derives them directly from the constraints. They are fecundity, synergy, integrity, and harmony.
Let's break down the mechanics of those, because honestly, they sound like words on a corporate motivational poster, but they are actually engineering solutions. Let's look at fecundity. This is the solution to the thermodynamic dilemma, right?
Yep.
Fecundity isn't just growth. It is the precise balancing of the thermodynamic ledger, investing just enough energy to preserve the system's core structure while spending the rest to adapt and grow into the future.
Perfect. Then you have synergy, which solves the boundary dilemma. Synergy is the engineering state where you allow individual parts enough agency to thrive and adapt without letting them become cancerous, while organizing them to serve the collective whole without crushing them.
Next is integrity. This solves the information dilemma. Integrity in a physics sense isn't about being a nice person, is it?
No, not at all.
It is the continuous, metabolically expensive habit of updating your internal model to match external reality. It is synthesizing that cheap historical wisdom with the really hard work of real-time truth-seeking.
And finally, harmony solves the control dilemma. Harmony is a structural synthesis. It's building a system that can deploy centralized speed when facing an immediate crisis, but default to distributed decentralized resilience for long-term stability.
The crucial shift here is realizing that fecundity, synergy, integrity, and harmony are not items you pick from a philosophical buffet because they sound pleasant.
Right, they are mandatory engineering solutions.
Yeah.
A system that violates these doesn't just become immoral in some abstract debated sense. It physically dissolves back into heat death. The bridge collapses. It ceases to exist.
Which means subjective values is a category error. We've been confusing instrumental preferences like, whether you prefer chocolate or vanilla ice cream with actual survival constraints, like whether your system prioritizes growth or stagnation.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if ethics are actually derived from physics, the real-world stakes are massive. We can look at human history through a completely different lens. We can look at the predictable collapse of major civilizations.
Yes. Kunis refers to this mechanism as the axiological Malthusian trap. Axiology is simply the philosophical study of value, and a Malthusian trap usually refers to a population outgrowing its food supply. But an axiological Malthusian trap happens when a system outgrows its own physical constraints.
Think about the Roman Empire or the British Empire. A civilization fights tooth and nail to survive, utilizing those four virtues. They achieve incredible abundance. Because they suddenly have so much excess energy and security, the physical constraints loosen. They no longer feel the immediate biting threat of entropy. So what happens mechanically?
They abandon the expensive, difficult-derived virtues. They choose present comfort over future capacity, failing the thermodynamic dilemma. They choose the cheap, cached narrative of their own greatness over the expensive, empirical test of reality, which fails the information dilemma.
And then they collapse. It's not bad luck. It's not the gods punishing them for decadent morals. It is just physics reasserting itself. The system violated the engineering specifications for persistence, and the universe just deleted it.
And this framework applies to our future just as aggressively as our past. Think about the current crisis around AI alignment.
Oh, right.
We are currently trying to figure out how to build incredibly powerful, goal-directed artificial intelligence systems, and we are terrified of what values they might adopt.
We're trying to program them with fuzzy, debated human ethical preferences. Like, let's read them some Kant, maybe some utilitarianism, and hope for the best.
Right, but Kunis's framework suggests that any AI, regardless of its substrate, whether it runs on silicon instead of carbon, is still fundamentally a telic system. It is a machine processing information to fight entropy.
Which means it faces the exact same four physical dilemmas. It has finite energy limits in its server farms. It has to define its boundaries. What is the AI versus what is the user or the environment? It has to acquire information, balancing its static training data against real-time inputs. And it has to coordinate its computation.
So the goal shouldn't be to align AI with human philosophy. The goal should be to align AI to the physics of persistence.
Because if we don't, it either destroys us, which is a boundary dilemma failure where it acts like a cancer, optimizing its own silicon parts at the expense of our shared planetary whole, or it completely self-destructs.
It really reframes the whole problem. And it even offers a chilling, physics-based answer to the Fermi paradox.
The great cosmic mystery. If the universe is so vast and so old, where are all the alien civilizations? Why is the galaxy completely silent?
The physics of persistence explains the silence. The trap is nearly perfect. Any alien civilization that becomes intelligent enough to solve its immediate survival problems eventually achieves that same abundance Rome achieved.
Right.
Once it achieves abundance, the thermodynamic pressure drops. It relaxes its adherence to the four dilemmas. It stops optimizing for deep-time persistence, stops expanding, turns inward toward virtual reality or mere comfort, and quietly fades out. The physics dictate that making it past that point of abundance requires a conscious, metabolically expensive choice.
You have to actively choose to keep obeying the engineering constraints of survival, even when you feel safe enough to ignore them.
Exactly.
That is profound. It's a completely different way to look at the night sky, which honestly begs the biggest question of this entire deep dive. If this framework is really this clean, just four dilemmas leading to four optimal solutions, why did brilliant minds spend 3,000 years wandering the library and missing it?
This raises an important question, and Kunis actually includes an appendix in the essay surveying 12 major thinkers who tried to brush up against this idea and failed. There is a universal failure mode that past philosophers fell into when trying to link physics and behavior.
Let's look at a couple of the heavy hitters, like Carl Friston. He's famous for the free energy principle in neuroscience and biology.
Friston is undeniably brilliant, and his principle that biological systems act to minimize surprise is very close to Kunis's physics. But Friston kept it purely descriptive. He described what surviving systems do in the moment. He never crossed the bridge to conditionally state what systems must do over deep time to persist, and therefore he couldn't derive any operational virtues or ethics from it.
So it remained an observation of the present, not an engineering manual for the future.
Right. And then on the total opposite end of the spectrum, you have someone like Hans Jonas.
Yes, so in 1979, Jonas tried to derive ethics directly from biology, but his mechanical mistake was that he intentionally violated Hume's guillotine. He just declared, as an ontological fact, that life creates value, and therefore anything that must be done to survive ought to be done.
He smuggled the normativity right in through the back door.
Exactly. He basically said, surviving is objectively morally good, which Hume mathematically proved you cannot just declare from a physical observation.
Every attempt in the last few centuries either stayed purely descriptive, like Friston, or collapsed into an unearned moral claim, like Jonas. Kunis avoids this trap by staying fiercely conditional the entire time. If you want to persist, you must do X.
He builds the whole system, the four dilemmas, the four virtues, all the way down without ever making a single moral claim.
Until the very, very end of the essay, Kunis makes only one explicit, self-selecting assumption to close the loop. The baseline assumption that more aliveness is preferable to less.
And the genius of that is that it's self-selecting. because if a biological system or a society disagrees and decides it actually prefers less aliveness, well, it simply dissolves into heat death and removes itself from the argument entirely. Only the persisting systems are left around to have the conversation.
Yes, a minimal, honest collapse of the argument, rather than smuggling in human values and pretending they're universal laws.
So what does this all mean? We started with David Hume's 18th century guillotine, which convinced the world that ethics and physics were totally separate domains. We looked at how goal-directed systems, from viruses replicating DNA to AI processing data to empires building aqueducts, are all forced to navigate the strict thermodynamics of energy, boundaries, information, and control.
It's all connected.
It is. We saw how calling values subjective is actually a fatal category error, and how the failure to follow the physics of persistence explains everything from the fall of the Roman Empire to the eerie silence of the Fermi paradox. Ethics isn't a debate about preferences, it's the engineering manual for surviving entropy.
And that manual applies at every single scale of reality, from the galactic all the way down to the personal.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. Because Kunis mentions briefly that this physics framework applies directly to personal flourishing, but he leaves the day-to-day application up to us. So I want you to think about the information dilemma in your own life right now. The constant physical balance between cheap cached historical data and the metabolic cost of real-time sensing.
It's a tough balance.
It really is. When it comes to your own identity, your daily habits, your assumptions about your career, are you just driving the commute on autopilot? Are you relying on cheap data, like old assumptions about who you are and what you're capable of just because it's easy and costs no mental energy? Or are you willing to pay the high metabolic costs of real-time sensing? Are you willing to look at your life honestly, gather expensive new data, update your model of reality, and do the hard work of change?
That's the real test.
Physics dictates that you have to balance this if you want to persist and grow. So look at the telic system of your own life today. Are you actively engineering a bridge that is going to stand the test of time, or are you just waiting for gravity to do its work?